If you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and open up to 3 John. 3 John is where we're going to spend our time tonight together. It's been a couple weeks since we've had an opportunity on Sunday nights to jump back into kind of this format. 2 weeks ago, we had Ralph Gilmore here with us. Last week, of course, we had our Lads to Leaders showcase, which was great. That's all on YouTube. I hope that you'll go back and check both of those. But we are finally wrapping up the letters that John wrote to some of the early Christians. And I'll kind of just go ahead and tell you this. I've had a few people ask where we're going to be going. Remember, we're kind of oscillating back and forth between Old Testament and New Testament books. There is a very loose rhyme and reason to this. Like again, for example, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were written obviously to Christians. It dealt chiefly with the church and the essence of Christ and fighting some of the Gnostics. So some of that's unique to the New Testament, but again, kind of the heart of that is obedience in the church and Christ is the Messiah. So we're going to look back into the Old Testament next and find some books here to look at that kind of shift the focus a little bit. So with no more preamble, we're going to look at 1st and 2nd Samuel next. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, again, is following the prophet Samuel, and there's way more stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel than that you know well, that you may not realize are in 1st and 2nd Samuel. This is dealing a lot with King David and King Saul. So there's a tremendous amount there, but it's following Samuel and the life of Samuel, and as he kind of chronicles and talks to some of the great influential leaders of the Old Testament. So we're gonna take, that'll be our next little bit as we'll jump back into the Old Testament, started with Joshua, works into 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And Lord willing, if we have enough time together, the idea is to work through the whole Bible. Right? It'll take a little bit to get through every single book, but that's the aim, right? So that's going to be the plan there. Okay, 3rd John. So just as a reminder, since it's been a couple weeks, 3rd John, all the epistles of John, the Johnine epistles, really don't have big opening and closings the way that other epistles do. This is written to Christians. One of the primary kind of focuses here is false teaching and things that he saw. Because remember, again, John was one of, if not the oldest apostle that saw the church really get going. But then maybe not more importantly, but it certainly influenced his writing. Because remember, John wrote the Gospel of John, wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then also wrote Revelation. And so by the later part of his life, he began to see Christianity start to struggle. And Christ knew this would happen, right? This was not a unique phenomenon, but people began to lose some of the influence of the original writers and the original teachers, right? Christ is gone. Many of the other apostles are gone. And so John is now writing these back. And 3rd John in particular is basically a letter. All of these are epistles, they're letters, but this one's written to individual people, and we're going to look at that more together. This is kind of the outline that I've given, 4 sections out of 3rd John. We'll kind of loosely follow this. We'll look first at Gaius. Gaius is we don't know exactly who this Gaius is. Gaius was a very popular name in 1st century Rome. There's a couple other usages of Gaius throughout Scripture, but they may or may not be the same person. But Gaius was, as I put in my outline, a man with the right balance. Gaius was walking in the truth. And if you remember, think back a couple months at this point when we were in 1st John, one of the pillars of these epistles is truth and obedience and walking in the truth. And what does that mean? So Gaius, John commends him for living spiritually, walking truthfully, serving faithfully, and then ministering generously. He's going to talk about hospitality. And what it means to take people into your home. And there's sort of a unique, because remember, hospitality, I think, is one of those that we, because culturally we don't do it at least as much now, even 50 years ago, in our exact context, hospitality was probably more widely practiced. Go back a couple thousand years, and it was a huge part of their lives. It wasn't just taking somebody out to eat. It was putting them up in your home. It was meant to be a sacrifice. It was giving them money and provision to get to their next stop. right? So this hospitality idea was an important thing, and by John's estimation, Gaius did it well. The second kind of section of this is Diotrephes. This is a man that clearly had a negative agenda. This was somebody that was holding back the letters that John was writing to the churches. We don't know a ton about him, but we get the idea that he had some position of influence there and was throttling what the church was allowed to hear and not. And John calls him out by name. This is not the only time this has happened. Paul did this in 2 Timothy, talking about Alexander, right, who was an unrighteous man. So this was something the apostles did from time to time. He didn't withdraw from him, although John would have had the authority to do so. But that's not the suggestion here. But he's talking about Diotrephes as a man with a harmful agenda. And I've got it written kind of 4 points here too. That he was, don't be driven by pride, don't be driven by arrogance, don't deliver accusations, and then looking at how all that kind of fits within the church. Then we're going to look at kind of some of the closing thoughts of John. All right, so let's read this together. 3 John, it's a short letter. It reads really quickly, 1 through 15. And then if you've been here with us this whole time, you can say, I've read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Pat yourself on the back. All right, let's read this together. 3 John, starting in verse 1. The elder, again, if you remember back 2 weeks ago, this started chiefly in 2 John. That's just John identifying himself, right? Because remember, this is still apocalyptic literature. Early Rome is still very alive and well, so there's some real reason to, if John had self-identified as, hey, this is John, such and such, they'd have been kicking down his door and he'd have probably been killed. That was the fear. So the elder, and if you look back in my Bible, this just on 2 pages, look back just 1 page in 2 John, he identifies the exact same way. All right, the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul. For I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Beloved, it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. For they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like this, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. Little pause, and we'll get to this more as we dive into the text. There's a unique kind of postulation here that John is suggesting. He's talking about hospitality. He's talking about taking people in that are professing truth and what he's wanting them to understand. And I think this is something that culturally has kind of gotten lost on us. But John's assertion here is by helping, by even as something as simple as offering somebody a night's rest in your home, you are partaking in their ministry. You are a fellow worker in the ministry that they are doing. And that's kind of why I think John in the end of 1 John into 2 John was giving them such a caution about welcoming, as he puts it, false teachers into your home, right? Because you might think, oh, well, that's not that big a deal, right? But John is saying, listen, when you do this, hospitality, whatever this may be, you're partaking in the ministry. Right? That's something that you're co-engaging in. That's the way he's putting it here. We'll talk about that more, verse 8. We ought to support people like this that we may be fellow workers. The original language literally means of like kind. So those people that are coming in that you're helping, again, you may not be the one going and preaching and teaching. I think it's a beautiful symmetry and parallel over to what Paul talks about as the church, right? That not everybody's going to be a hand or an ear or a foot, that the body is made up of multiple kinds. And John's saying, listen, you may not be the one going and teaching and preaching, but as he's talking about it here, hospitality, and that's not an exclusive list, right? But he's saying things such as hospitality, you're engaging in that ministry. Again, there's things like giving. I mean, we talk about this a lot, that we're called to give as a sacrificial worship, but it's also this idea that we are indirectly serving in the ministry. And that's what Paul is kind of pointing to here, or John rather, got Paul on the brain. We may be fellow workers of the truth. I just love that phrase. I hope that you'll highlight that in your Bible. I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. You notice he's talking this in plural, right? It's not my authority, our authority. So the inference there is that Diotrephes, whoever this may be, was challenging not only John, but all of the early church leaders, the apostles that would have had the authority to come and teach and preach. He's saying, who are you to come in and teach and to preach? And John's going to call this out very directly, and we'll kind of dive into more of that in a moment. But again, Diotrephes, who wants to put himself first, you can kind of put in parentheses there, his pride. I mean, plain and simple, it's pride. He wants to be viewed as the guy, not John. Although I don't think John would have ever viewed it that way. But that's clearly that's what Diotrephes was wanting. Does not acknowledge our authority. So if I came, I will bring up what he's doing. Talking, I love the phrasing here, wicked nonsense against us. And not contend with. He refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil is not from God. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. And then this is kind of his final greeting, or final kind of salutation here. I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write it with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon. We will talk face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, each by name. And that's John's kind of closing greeting, so to speak, to these Christians here. So let's kind of dive this in. We'll kind of dive in verse by verse as we've done all along the way here. We'll go back up to verse 1. The elder to the beloved Gaius. Again, the elder is just John identifying himself. We certainly, if you look back in kind of ancient non-biblical texts, but texts that were of that time, almost everyone understood this to be John. John was sort of close to that area geographically. He had already began to talk to this group. So him identifying as the elder, they all knew that to be, to be John. Gaius, again, we don't know specifically who this is. If you want to make these references, these kind of notes, other mentions of men named Gaius, Acts 19, 29, chapter 20 and verse 4. Romans 16, 1 Corinthians 1, all mention Gaius's, multiple mentions of men named Gaius, but that was a super popular, that was almost like John in our context. It was a super popular name. The chances of all of those being one man is near 0%. But is this Gaius one of those? Very likely, but we just don't know which one. Again, Gaius was such a common name in the early Roman Empire. Verses 2 through 4. Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you. That was such a common greeting that in ancient Greek manuscripts, there's actually abbreviations in the Greek that just means this exact phrase. Now, it's spelled out in our Bible, but the fact all may go well with you and that you may be in good health, it essentially means all is well, I am well, and I'm glad you're well, right? All he's saying is, I'm glad that you're prospering, right? This is not prosperity gospel. This is not John making any assertions to that. But what he is saying, what's interesting about this is look at the last part of this. The first, if you kind of nix out, beloved, I pray, starting at all may go well with you and that you may be in good health. That's kind of the phrase that was commonly used in the Greek. Again, so prolific that it gets just abbreviated. Just as an acronym there. But the second part of that, as it goes well with your soul, is a unique inclusion that John adds. And the assertion here, of course, is that he says, I hope things are well, but above all, I hope your spirit is well. I hope that your body and everything that comes along with that is prospering only because your spirit is prospering. Does that make sense? He's wanting those two things to be intrinsically connected. Again, he uses this common phrase, and he's given his best wishes to Gaius. Just as your soul prospers. Again, he's making this kind of connection between conditions of our health and conditions of our soul. He keeps going and he says, for I rejoice greatly when my brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. And again, that is sort of the linchpin, if you want to think of it that way, the focus of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. I rejoice greatly, essentially, in the truth, that you are walking in the truth. And then verse 4, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in the truth. And again, John's kind of goodwill towards Gaius, came that, and part of it was his understanding that Gaius was walking in the truth, knowing that people had came and testified that he was doing well. To walk in truth is that understanding of a genuine, it's not just to know the truth, right? That's kind of one of John's big kind of things that we've talked about all through this. It's not just as simple as to say, do we know the text? Do we know what Scripture says? John says, it's not good enough. He says, what I rejoice in, there's no greater joy than to hear that my children, and by extension Gaius, are walking in the truth. Taking the truth that they understand, taking the knowledge and putting that down into your heart, into your soul, into your spirit, into your everyday life, and doing something with it. Right, that is John's way of pointing out what Christ pointed out many times in his life. Many times when he was fighting against the Pharisees and saying, you all have all the knowledge, but you're missing every ounce of application. They would be the poster child for not doing what John is saying. There is no greater joy than when I hear that my children, the people that have come to know Christ, are walking in the truth. And that's the challenge, one of the great challenges of 3rd John for you and me, I think. When we look, if John were to take a kind of a tertiary look at our life, would he say that about us? Would Christ look at us? Would he chastise us the way he did the Pharisees and say, hey, you've got all the knowledge in the world. Who cares? What's that matter? Knowledge alone is not going to do you an ounce of good unless something gets put into practice. Right? You can know Scripture all day long, but until you take the step to put on Christ and in obedience and baptism, knowledge is just knowledge. Again, coming from Christ himself probably is the peak there, but I think John gives us some great insight. I have no greater joy than to hear my children are walking in the truth. Then he begins to talk about Gaius, and he says, beloved, it's a faithful thing that you do, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are. I'm kind of reminded of Matthew 25. Matthew 25, if you want to flip over there briefly, in verse 21. He says, it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts. In all your efforts. What that means in the original language is your whole life. Everything you touch, you're a faithful witness in. We look at Matthew 25, 21. Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful over a few things, and I'll make you ruler over many. Right? John is pointing to Gaius and saying, thank you for being faithful over the few things. Right? Relatively few. Because that's the emphasis, is this life is fleeting. All the things that we succeed or don't here on this side of eternity aren't going to matter. But you're faithful over those. It's faithful things that you do in all your efforts for the brothers. And again, strangers as they may be. He's saying your love for them isn't predicated on knowing them, on having, they're not family, they're not great friends, they're strangers. But what binds us together is Christ. And he's saying there's nothing better than that. Then he goes on, who testified, these strangers, they testified to your love before the church. And you will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. For they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. again, thinking about this idea of in Matthew chapter 10, in verse 42, Jesus promises and says, whatever, even if I've received a cup of water, right, I'll return that back. And there's this idea of faithful Christian living that he's commending Gaius on here. He talks about, taking nothing from the Gentiles. And again, there's over the years been a lot of questions as to kind of what that means. I'll read you an excerpt from a commentary I've got. I think it kind of explains this well. The ancient world of the early church was filled with missionaries, with preachers of various kinds and creeds, and many supported themselves by taking offerings from the general public. John said that these quote-unquote Christian missionaries should take nothing from the Gentiles, non-Christians at that time, non-Christians. Instead of soliciting funds from the general public, they were to look to support fellow Christians. It's less about the Gentiles and more about this idea of one of the other kind of secondary themes of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John is unity in the body. And he's saying, listen, if we have an opportunity to support other Christians, other people that are going and preaching and teaching, why aren't we? And that's his emphasis to them there. Because he says in verse 8, therefore we ought to support people like this, that we may be fellow workers of the truth. Let's go to verse 9. We'll read down through verse 11. Starts talking about Diotrephes. Again, a bad example of what not to do. I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. Again, talking plural, talking about the apostles' authority. So if I came, I'll bring up what he's doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, and not content with that. He refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil is not from God. Again, John's kind of publicly by name rebuking Diotrephes, and you might think, well, that's harsh, but again, that's really following in line. John's not the only one to do this. Again, 2 Timothy chapter 4, Alexander gets pointed out by name. Paul's talking to Timothy and says, listen, Alexander is unrighteous. The coppersmith did me much evil, and the Lord will reward him according to his works. Diotrephes was clearly presenting himself as kind of this Christian leader in the early church, an early church leader there. But, what's interesting is what he's doing is really in stark contrast with what is commanded of church leadership, right? And John is kind of cautioning here. And again, saying we ought to support the fellow workers of truth, but Diotrephes, church isn't about one man. Right? I mean, the eldership is given to the church to help guide the flock. But great elders understand that they're temporary leadership, right? That it's not about them necessarily. It's about Christ to establish the church. And if it ever becomes about one man or even a group of men, we've gone off the rails. John is saying it's not about him. And again, now there is. If John had actually been doing anything unscriptural, I mean, there is an element of leadership, of church leadership, of eldership that is shepherd, that is guiding the flock, right? But that's we don't get the sense that's what Diotrephes was doing at all. What he was doing is grandstanding, right? I'm in charge. Look at me. Forget John, forget his apostolic position, forget all that he's been given the authority to do. Look at me. And John says there's no place for that. He says there's absolutely no place for that. And he goes even as far, again, to say, if I come, I will bring this up, what he's doing, talking wicked nonsense against us and not content with. And he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. That phrase, talking wicked nonsense, this is the ESV. That's probably an okay translation, although I think the literal translation is something more akin to slander, to gossip, malicious talk, right? It's not just, it doesn't have value. It's that it's actively degrading the church and the people of the church. Malicious words is that idea. I read this. The Greek word, which gets translated, wicked nonsense, more closely akin to gossip, comes from the root, which was used of the action of water boiling up and throwing off bubbles. Bubbles are empty and useless. The verb eventually came to mean indulgence in empty or useless talk. This was the nature of Diotrephes' slander. Of course, the words were no less evil in that they were groundless. That's the idea, is that he was actively degrading the leadership of John and the foundation of the early church. And John saying, it can't stand. If I come, I'm going to bring it up. But don't imitate evil, but imitate good. And then he kind of jumps off quickly and talks about Demetrius, a good example. He says he's received a good testimony from everyone, from the truth itself. And we also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. If you've ever read this and thought, why is that there, right? Talking about Gaius, I get, makes perfect sense, right? That's the good example. Diophines is the bad example, so you have good and bad. But what does he have to do with anything? More than likely, Demetrius might have been the man that John had given the letter to go back to the church. And so this was John's way of kind of giving him some credence of like, hey, he's a good man. We've had an opportunity to talk. He is a fellow believer. He's not one of the false teachers that I've been cautioning you about. Right? More than likely, Demetrius would have been in Rome, where he would have been sending the letter from. So again, kind of just a quick little inclusion, and then we'll jump into 13, 14, and 15. I had much to write to you. Again, so much. It seems simple, but John's plating a precedence here on being together. I had much to write you, but I would rather not write it with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you. Greet the friends, each by name. He's writing and he's saying, I've got a lot to say. There's a lot more to talk about. But at the end of the day, I'd rather be there with you. I'd rather be there face to face. We talked about this a little bit in our debate workshops with the Lads Leaders kids, of this idea of, again, probably only a secondary argument, but this idea that John is writing and saying, listen, I've got a lot to say, but writing it is not the end all be all. I need to be there. Let's talk. Let's sit down face to face. Let's interface and talk through some of the issues. Let's rejoice in the good stuff, right? And that gives us precedence of we've got to be together. We have to. Doing it, from afar works for a time. But John is saying it's just not good enough long term. He literally stopped his letter short to say, I got a lot to say, but I'd rather come say it in person. We look through, and I hope, again, all three of these letters are kind of unique in that he's writing to touch on specific things. I told you week 1, and I reminded you a couple times, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are not what we would call systematic theology books, meaning that you're not going to find the heart of the gospel in these. These are much more specific to some of the needs of these Christians. But my prayer is that you've been encouraged, challenged by some of this, right? Again, sometimes I think we have the impression that the early church had it so great, right? We look and we recognize, man, I bet some of the issues that we're facing now, they never faced that back then. But most of that's just, there is nuance to what we're experiencing now, but you even go back then and you see there were people that were trying to take over the church then. There was people trying to encroach in. John was having to keep things at bay. The heart of mankind has never changed. The nuance of it changes. And John gives us some encouragement, and he just says, peace be with you, but at the end of the day, pursue truth. And that's really the idea of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope that this has given you some context into the latter portion of John's life as we've looked through this. We're extending the invitation. Anytime we come together, we always want to offer the invitation to anybody that might need it. If you have never put on Christ, and again, this whole 3 letters is written to Christians. It's unapologetically written to Christians in the sense that it almost hampers the flow of writing because John so directly assumes that the people reading have already become Christians and put on Christ. There's a lot of nuance and context that he just completely omits because he's assuming that this is going to be read in church to people that already knew what was going on. So all of this encouragement, all this instruction is predicated on, are you a Christ follower? And if not, do something about that. So we'll extend that invitation tonight. If you've never put on Christ, you're welcome to come and do that tonight. Maybe you just need prayers. We'd love to help you with that too. If we can do anything for you, would you come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing together?